Have you ever wondered how us pilots and engineers could stare into the stripped hull of a captured Japanese bomber and ask themselves this question? Why did this aircraft, the Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber, carry unprotected fuel tanks with almost no armor for the crew? What did they see in the hangar at Clark Field that winter of 1945 that forced them to rethink how this machine, once the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service, had become so vulnerable? What lessons were hidden in those thin wings and exposed tanks? Lessons about risk, doctrine, desperation, and the brutal calculus of war. In late January 1945, Allied technicians and aircrew assembled around a captured Betty at Clark Field in the Philippines. They had obtained the aircraft from the Japanese, its mission-capable form preserved enough for serious study. The context, the war in the Pacific, had shifted profoundly, and the once feared symbols of Japanese naval air power were now being dissected by the very air forces they had once haunted. Among them stood us pilots whose lives had been shaped by dogfights and torpedo raids. Now they moved slowly along the Betty's fuselage, ran their hands over riveted skin, peered into the bomb bay, and then paused before the unsealed fuel tanks. They saw tanks mounted in the wings and fuselage, but with no self-sealing rubber or foam patches that the U.S. bomber crews had come to assume were standard. They saw no significant armor plating around the crew stations, no redundant fuel systems, and scant protection for the gunners, and they asked, why? The silence in that hangar stretched longer than any bomber's engine roar during the war. To understand this, one must step back to the aircraft's origins. The Mitsubishi G4M was introduced on the 2nd of April 1941 as the land-based twin-engine long-range bomber of the Japanese Navy, intended to project air power deep into enemy territory. From inception, the design reflected one priority above all: range. The Imperial Japanese Navy wanted a bomber that could reach far-flung targets across the Pacific, India, and Southeast Asia, refuel at minimal bases, and strike swiftly. The G4M achieved that. Lightweight, large internal fuel capacity, streamlined aerodynamics, but that weight saving came at a cost. No self-sealing fuel tanks, minimal armor, a fuselage nearly devoid of bullet-resistant plating. Historians note this: the G4M's flimsy structure and almost total lack of crew protection formed the trade-off for its performance. Picture a quiet field at dawn in the Philippines. The Betty sits, silver and olive drab mottled wings stretching wide. A U.S. pilot in his faded flight jacket walks slowly around the nose, his boots crunching on tarmac soaked by lingering humidity. He remembers dogfights above the Solomon Islands, Kamikaze eyes, the roar of Japanese bombers coming in low to torpedo U.S. cruisers. He recalls one mission in January 1943 when 3 Bettys of the 347th Fighter Group were engaged near Rennell Island. One of those bombers sank the heavy cruiser USS Chicago. He touches the Belgian honeycomb of the wing's cross-section, runs a gloved finger along the fuel line, and feels unease. Was this really built to fight, or built to reach? The first time U.S. airmen encountered the G4M in large numbers, they gave it a grim nickname, the Flying Lighter, because a single hit to the tanks could ignite the bomber like a torch. They didn't know yet, in that hangar, how many crews had perished because fuel spilled, ignited, and tore the bomber apart mid-air. But the evidence of that vulnerability was etched into the design. And now before them, stripped of its markings, the machine laid bare the cause. As the Americans gathered data, one of their engineers pulled off the metal plate covering the wing root and exposed a rectangular fuel tank. He showed it to a pilot. See this? No self-seal, no armor. The pilot nodded. He thought of his own B-17s and B-24s flying over Europe, fuel tanks surrounded by foam-armored bulkheads protecting the waist gunners. He wondered why the Japanese hadn't followed the same doctrine. The answer lay in the strategic imperative and in a misjudgment of aerial warfare's harsh realities. The Japanese insisted that speed and range would be more protective than armor, that being faster, being further, being at altitude or distance would reduce exposure. But over months of war, this assumption proved tragically optimistic. Back in early 1942, the G4M had been effective. It had contributed to the sinking of the British battleship HMS Prince of Wales and battlecruiser HMS Repulse, the first time capital ships were sunk while defending themselves at sea. The bomber's long reach enabled attacks from bases beyond immediate enemy fighter range and gave Japanese naval strategy a significant edge. But as US fighters improved, Allied radar and long-range escort tactics matured, the vulnerabilities of the design began to tell. What the U.S. pilots saw at Clark Field was not just a captured aircraft. They saw the remains of a strategic gamble. The gamble had lost. In the dim hangar light bulb overhead humming, a technician flicked on a lamp to illuminate the fuel tank seams. The pilot watched the shadowed forms of preserved wiring loom and hydraulic lines. He thought of the cramped gunners' positions, the thin plexiglass of the waist windows, the absence of armor plating that in Allied designs would have been standard. The Americans measured weight savings claimed, range achieved, impressive, but the casualty list, staggering. The design had threaded a razor's edge between capability and survival, and the edge had broken. The U.S. airmen gathered the data from the captured Betty, filed reports through the Technical Air Intelligence Unit, Southwest Pacific Area TAIUSWPA, and the Technical Air Intelligence Center TAIC. In many test reports, Allied engineers described the fuel system layout, the lack of compartmentalization, the thin sheet metal construction. Some historians have questioned the exact provenance of that particular captured machine. Records remain unclear whether the wreck was one of many stripped for parts in 1945, or an intact recovery from a forced landing, but the physical evidence was clear enough. This bomber was vulnerable. In the pages of the intelligence bulletins, U.S. pilots' comments were terse: fuel tanks not protected, crew stations no armor, structure light, range good, survivability low. The reality of war weighed in black and white sheets. The emotional weight of that hangar afternoon was heavier than the metal itself. The pilot remembered the dozen aircrew he had lost in 2 years of fighting in the Pacific, the tailgunner who slid into his seat just before launch, the navigator who wrote letters to his daughters the night before the raid, the bombardier who smiled at the dawn briefing and then never returned. He thought, they paid the price of this design weakness. He counted the lives gone, ships sunk, skies darkened. The captured Betty wasn't just an aircraft, it was a ledger of human cost. Now imagine a mission in mid-1944. Japanese crews flying the G4M deep into the Marianas, torpedo-armed, low-level, vulnerable to the Hellcats and Corsairs. A single 20 cannon round finds the wing root, ruptures the thin sheet metal, and fuel sprays into the airstream. Moments later, a spark catches, flames blossom across the wing. The bomber becomes a fireball. Some crews survive by bailing out, but many do not. Some historians quantify the British and American assessment of the G4M's loss rate as among the worst for any bomber of its class in the war. The nickname Flying Lighter haunted every after-action report, and yet the design remained in service, forced by resource limitations and strategic necessity. The U.S. pilot placed a gloved hand on the wing strut of the captured machine and leaned in. He could smell the faint oil residue, hear the ghost echo of propellers. Imagine the night raids across the Philippines, the flash of enemy gunners, the thunder of anti-aircraft fire. He asked himself, if this were our bomber, how would we feel, knowing that one hit could burst our aircraft into flame? And he answered, we would trust the armor, the redundancy, the separation of fuel tanks, not hope for distance and speed alone. The captured Betty revealed that trust missing, yet the story is not purely one of failure, it is also one of learning. The Allies learned from captured machines like the Betty. They studied range versus protection trade-offs, improved their tactics, refined their escort planning. They understood that aircrew survival could not be assumed, that speed might buy seconds, but not immunity. Therefore, the hangar at Clark Field became an unintended classroom, the captured bomber a textbook of hard lessons. The irony is bitter. The aircraft that once loomed over the Pacific theater in terror now sat in a foreign hangar serving education to its enemy. As the pilot prepared to leave the hangar, twilight outside, a cloud of mosquitoes drifting in through the open door. He looked back at the Betty's nosegun turret, the gleaming green-painted interior, the wiring looms still in place. He thought of the young Japanese crew, likely in their 20s, who had flown this machine into danger, confident in their mission. He thought of their fate. He thought of his own fate, and how fragile it all was. War, he realized, was as much a fight against metal and aerodynamics as it was against fear and loss, and the captured Betty epitomized that intersection. In the months that followed, further losses caused the Japanese to introduce the G4M2 and G4M3 variants with self-sealing fuel tanks, and some armor protection, but by then the tide had turned. The offset in design came too late to change the course of the air war. For the U.S. pilots standing in that hangar, the lesson was clear. Range without protection is an invitation to disaster, and that machine they had once dreaded now stood as an indictment of vulnerabilities. In conclusion, the captured Betty bomber at Clark Field is more than a technical curiosity. It stands as a symbol of war, as harsh arithmetic. Design decisions made under the pressure of strategy, risk assessments tested in fire and blood, and the costs borne by young men who climbed into the cockpit at dawn, uncertain if they would see dusk. For us watching now, it offers a moment of reflection. Every machine carries stories, and some speak not of triumph, but of the quiet loss that follows engineering choices. The Betty's unprotected fuel tanks whispered one of the most unforgiving truths of the air war. Vulnerability does not wait to be discovered, it awaits to be exploited. Under the dim canopy of the hangar, as engineers packed their notes and folded their measuring tapes, the captured Betty remained silent, almost dignified, its skin catching the last amber light of the Philippine dusk. The U.S. pilots left the scene, yet the mystery lingered. Why would a nation as meticulous as Japan, with its disciplined naval aviation doctrine, send its crews into battle encased in such fragility? The Americans had seen the results of these choices firsthand, burning silhouettes falling into the Pacific, black smoke rising from the sea, but they still wanted to understand why. What belief, what calculation, led Japanese designers to build a machine that could carry bombs across an ocean but could not protect the men inside it? The answer lay in Japan's pre-war vision of air power, vision shaped by geography, ambition, and a deep fear of isolation. Japan's empire stretched over thousands of miles of ocean, its islands scattered like stepping stones. To maintain control, it needed aircraft that could reach far beyond traditional naval limits. The Mitsubishi G4M was conceived as the tool for that reach. When Kiro Honjo, chief designer at Mitsubishi, began the project in the late 1930s, his instructions were explicit. The new bomber must fly 3,000 miles without refueling, carry a torpedo or heavy bomb load, and operate from short improvised island airstrips. Every kilogram mattered. Armor and self-sealing tanks were luxuries they could not afford, so they chose to remove them. In return, they gained range unmatched by any other land-based bomber of its era. It was a gamble rooted not in ignorance, but in strategic necessity. In the beginning, it worked. Early in the Pacific War, the G4M proved devastating. On December 10, 1941, only 3 days after Pearl Harbor, a formation of Betty bombers launched from bases in Saigon to hunt British capital ships off Malaya's coast. The results changed naval warfare forever. 2 Japanese air groups, flying G3Ms and G4Ms, struck the HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse. With precise torpedo runs at low altitude, they sank both ships within hours without the support of a single Japanese surface vessel. The world was stunned. It was the first time in history that battleships maneuvering in open water had been sunk entirely by aircraft. The Imperial Japanese Navy saw this as vindication. Their doctrine of speed and range had triumphed. No armor was needed if you struck first and struck hard. That triumph, however, hid the seeds of tragedy. Because what worked in 1941's clear skies above Malaya would fail under the heavy fire and radar-guided interception of 1943 and beyond. Once Allied fighters extended their reach, the Betty's light frame became a death sentence. Reports from the Solomons described Betty's bursting into flame after a single .50 caliber burst. Survivors spoke of crews trapped inside fireballs, of wings detaching in mid-air, of aircraft consumed before a mayday could even be sent. The plane's structure, its lightweight aluminum alloy, its unprotected fuel lines turned every hit into an inferno. And yet, production continued. By 1945, over 2,400 units had been built. The Imperial Navy persisted, believing the bomber's long legs were still essential for torpedo and maritime strikes, even as losses mounted beyond comprehension. Back at Clark Field, the American engineers compiling the intelligence report could see the evolution in the wreck before them. This particular G4M2 variant carried larger engines and revised turrets, but still no self-sealing tanks. They traced the fuel lines with grease pencils and took photographs for Washington. The lead engineer dictated observations into a recorder. Primary fuselage tanks unprotected, located in wings between frames 7 and 10. No foam or rubber lining. Armor plating, absent from crew stations. Structure 1.2 mm alloy, 2-4 SAT type. Design clearly prioritizes range. He paused, then added quietly. Crew safety appears secondary. Those words would later echo through U.S. Air Technical Intelligence reports as both observation and elegy. Meanwhile, on the Japanese side, the story was one of painful awareness. Pilots and maintenance crews knew the danger. They nicknamed their own machine Hamakita Cigar. They joked bitterly that one tracer hit would light the cigar. Veteran pilot Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most celebrated aces, recalled escorting Betty bombers over Guadalcanal. They were brave men, but the moment they were hit, the aircraft would explode like paper in a furnace. I watched them burn in the sky and could do nothing. For the U.S. intelligence officers studying the wreck, such testimonies only deepened their respect and sorrow for the airmen who had flown these machines. The Americans saw the paradox clearly. The Betty was both brilliant and doomed. Its long, sleek fuselage gave it aerodynamic efficiency unmatched by the clumsier Allied bombers. It could cruise at over 270 miles per hour, carry a Type 91 torpedo capable of crippling battleships, and travel 3,000 kilometers without refueling. For its time, it was a marvel of efficiency and design minimalism. But by the time it was examined in that hangar, the air war had shifted toward survivability. Self-sealing tanks and armor plating, even at the expense of range, had become standard practice. Technology and tactics had outpaced the philosophy that gave birth to the G4M. Outside, the air buzzed with the sounds of the war still raging, distant artillery, the occasional drone of American B-25s flying reconnaissance. Inside, the Betty seemed trapped between two worlds, the daring optimism of its creation and the ruin of its demise. When the Americans fired up one of its engines during a brief test, the hangar filled with the deep, throaty rumble of its Mitsubishi Kosei 21s. For a moment, they could almost imagine what it had been like to line up for takeoff from Rabaul or Palau, dawn rising over the sea, crews tightening harnesses and saying silent prayers. That sound, heavy and mournful, felt less like machinery and more like memory. The intelligence teams didn't just study for curiosity, they studied for survival. The Pacific still demanded long-range strikes, and lessons from enemy machines often shaped future AS designs. The captured Betty informed post-war assessments on lightweight bomber concepts, showing the perils of sacrificing protection for range. Engineers noted how the Betty's weight savings allowed remarkable endurance but rendered it catastrophically flammable. In a later debriefing, one U.S. ordnance officer compared it to the German Me-210, an aircraft designed for perfection on paper, betrayed by the realities of war. But what the Americans didn't always see in that hangar was the human cost written into the aluminum. In Japanese records, every sortie was a ledger of sacrifice. Crews flew knowing that if they were hit, escape was unlikely. Many carried small family photos taped near the instrument panels, others small charms blessed by Shinto priests. The fire risk was so great that they were instructed not to wear parachutes until immediately before takeoff. The added weight might cut into range. To be a Betty pilot was to fly with quiet fatalism, a professional acceptance of risk that bordered on spiritual devotion. In Japanese culture, that devotion was revered. In the American hangar, it was mourned. Later that same year, after months of study, the captured Betty was shipped to the United States. It arrived at Wright Field, Ohio, under the care of the Technical Air Intelligence Command. There, it was fully stripped, weighed, measured, and flown under controlled conditions. U.S. test pilots described the handling as surprisingly smooth like controls, steady at cruise but prone to violent fire once damaged. In one simulation, a controlled fuel line leak led to ignition within seconds. The flame raced down the wing faster than the crew could react. Even in peace, the Betty remained lethal to those inside it. As reports circulated through the War Department, the analysis began to crystallize. Japan's obsession with range had been its undoing. The G4M's design perfectly suited the first phase of the Pacific War, when Japan struck from faraway bases and dominated the skies. But once Allied fighters, radar, and anti-aircraft defenses extended their reach, the bomber's vulnerability turned it from a hunter into prey. The same speed that once ensured escape now ensured only that it would burn at higher altitude. It was a cruel irony, the kind history seldom forgets. For the American pilots who had examined it up close, the memory of that captured aircraft lingered long after the war. Many would later describe it as a turning point in their understanding of their enemy not as faceless adversaries, but as men who fought with courage despite impossible odds. Some even admitted a grudging admiration for the Betty's simplicity. She was a beautiful airplane, one U.S. Navy pilot wrote years later, just built for the wrong war. When Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, a formation of G4Ms carried the envoys to negotiate the terms of peace. Painted white, with green crosses replacing the rising suns, they flew low and unescorted to Okinawa. The same aircraft that had begun the Pacific War by sinking Allied ships now closed it by bearing the message of surrender. In that symbolism, history completed its cruel circle. Today, few Betty bombers survive. Most were lost to combat, weather, or time. The handful that remain, scattered in museums or half-buried in Pacific jungles, stand as fragile memorials to a generation of airmen and engineers who built machines that stretched human limits and paid dearly for it. The one examined by the Americans in 1945 was scrapped after testing, its components used for metallurgical study. Nothing remains but photographs and reports in paper records of a once mighty design. Yet, in a broader sense, the Betty's legacy lives on in the questions it forced engineers and strategists to confront. How much safety can be traded for performance? How much range is worth a crew's life? These are questions that transcend the war and linger into every era of aviation. In that way, the G4M continues to fly not through the skies, but through the memories and moral debates of those who design machines for war. The hangar at Clark Field has long since been reclaimed by the jungle, its roof rusted and its floor split by weeds. But if one could stand there now in the silence, perhaps one could still imagine the ghostly outline of that captured bomber, the light glinting on its unarmored wings and the faint echo of American boots, walking slowly around it, still asking the same question that began this story. Why did they build it this way? Because war, at its heart, is the collision of ideals and limitations. The Japanese built the Betty for a war of speed, distance, and initiative. The Americans built their bombers for endurance, protection, and industrial strength. In that difference lay the fate of thousands of airmen. And when the U.S. pilots examined the captured Betty, what they truly saw was not the failure of one airplane, but the anatomy of an empire's fading hope. The surrender flight of August 19, 1945, was unlike any in the history of aviation. At dawn, two Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers lifted off from Kisarazu Air Base near Tokyo. Their green Hinamaru markings, the proud red sun of Japan, had been hastily painted over with broad green crosses. They were flying to Aishima near Okinawa to deliver Japanese envoys who would finalize the surrender arrangements with General MacArthur's staff. The same model that had once carried torpedoes toward Allied fleets now bore diplomats toward peace. On the tarmac, American spotters watched through binoculars as the strange white-painted silhouettes approached. No one fired. Not a single gunner aimed, and as the Bettys touched down and taxied to a stop under armed escort, silence rolled across the airfield, a silence so thick that one pilot later said he could hear the tick of his own watch. The U.S. officers who stepped forward to greet the Japanese envoys couldn't help but glance at the bombers. Their thin skins still bore the scars of the war, patched bullet holes, rippled panels, scorched seams near the engine nest. To these Americans, the sight was surreal. For years, those same machines had been symbols of fear, harbingers of the night raids that struck Allied ships in the Solomons and Bismarck Sea. Now they sat motionless, disarmed, humbled, and silent ghosts of a war that had consumed millions. The contrast was almost biblical. In the days that followed, the Betty would appear again, this time as the backdrop to a vanishing empire. Photographs show the white-crossed bombers lined up neatly on the airfield, propellers still, as U.S. servicemen posed beside them. In those images lies the quiet irony of history. The aircraft that had once embodied Japan's reach across the Pacific now symbolized its return to the ground. Yet for those who had studied the bomber up close, engineers, test pilots, historians, its story remained a puzzle worth understanding. How could brilliance and fragility coexist so completely within one design? The technical answer has been well established. Mitsubishi's design bureau had pursued aerodynamic purity to an extreme. The G4M's fuselage was a perfect cylinder from nose to tail, a shape that reduced drag and allowed enormous internal fuel capacity. Its wings were long, high-aspect surfaces optimized for lift efficiency at cruise speeds. Every rivet, every bulkhead was weighed and reconsidered to minimize resistance. The designers achieved their target. The bomber could travel farther and faster than almost any of its contemporaries, but they paid for that success by stripping protection to the bone. Fuel tanks were integral to the wing structure itself, large unprotected cells that doubled as part of the load-bearing framework. To armor them would have required reinforcing the entire wing, adding hundreds of kilograms. In an era before lightweight self-sealing composites, the trade-off seemed unavoidable. Still, the deeper answer, the philosophical one, lay in the mindset of Imperial Japan. To the Japanese Naval Command, survival was secondary to mission success. The bomber was a tool of decisive battle, not of attrition. Crews were expected to complete their task, not to return at all costs. That same doctrine later evolved into the kamikaze ethos, but its roots were already visible in the design of the Betty. Efficiency, reach, and striking power mattered more than protection. As one Japanese engineer later admitted, "We built machines for the offensive spirit, not for the pilot's comfort." Two Western minds steeped in the industrial calculus of loss ratios and replacement cycles, such thinking seemed almost fatalistic. Yet within the Japanese worldview of 1941, it was consistent. The ideal warrior needed a weapon of reach, not refuge. U.S. intelligence officers who interviewed captured Japanese pilots after the war heard this theme repeated in different ways. One recalled being told, "Our duty was not to survive, but to deliver the blow." Another said, "Armor makes a man lazy. We preferred speed." These weren't empty boasts, they reflected an entire system of values. Japan's military culture prized initiative, spirit, and self-sacrifice. In that light, the unarmored Betty wasn't an oversight, it was a manifestation of faith in human will over material defense. But war, indifferent to faith, proved otherwise. When Allied fighters gained superiority, that faith met its breaking point. In the Solomons, the Bettys became slaughtered shadows against the sky. American pilots, flying rugged Hellcats and Lightnings, soon learned to exploit the bomber's vulnerability. They aimed for the wings where the fuel tanks sat. One or two bursts were enough. Post-action photos from Henderson Field show debris still smoldering hours after impact. Pilots who had once dreaded the G4M's long reach now saw it as prey. The pendulum of air power had swung back with merciless precision. After the war, American engineers studying the captured Bettys compared their findings with autopsies of downed aircraft across the Pacific. They found a grim consistency. Over 70% of all G4M losses were due to fire or explosion, not structural failure. Few crews survived bailouts. The speed of flame propagation was too high, and the exits too narrow. These statistics reached Washington, where analysts used them as evidence in post-war design doctrine. Self-sealing tanks, they concluded, were not optional, they were moral imperatives. Every future US bomber, from the B-29 to the B-47, would incorporate layered protection systems derived partly from lessons learned in that Philippine hangar. The Betty's story, however, didn't end with surrender. In China, remnants of the Imperial Navy's air arm were captured by both the nationalists and the communists. Some Bettys were repainted with Chinese markings and flown in limited service until 1949. Others became test beds for Soviet engineers studying Japanese metal. The Soviets, too, were fascinated by how much performance could be extracted from so little armor. Their reports echoed the Americans' ingenious design, dangerous compromise. In this way, the Betty influenced not just Japan's adversaries but the post-war balance of air power thinking worldwide. Yet amid all the technical dissection, the emotional truth remains the most haunting. The G4M was a weapon born from ambition and ended in tragedy. It began the Pacific War by demonstrating that aircraft could annihilate battleships and ended it by carrying emissaries of surrender. Between those 2 points stretched 1,000 fiery arcs, the final paths of crews who never came home. To walk beneath its wings today, in the few museums where fragments survive, is to feel the weight of that paradox. The rivets and panels tell a story not just of design, but of human conviction tested to destruction. Some American veterans who saw the captured Bettys later wrote about them with unexpected empathy. They spoke of the craftsmanship, the precision of Japanese manufacturing, the elegance of the airframe. One recalled running his hand over the smooth aluminum and thinking, "This could have been one of ours, if our priorities had been different." Another said he could not look at it without imagining the young Japanese crew who had once sat inside, laughing, perhaps scared, carrying the same hopes as any man in uniform. The longer one studies the machines of war, the less one sees enemies, only men caught in the same storm, flying toward different horizons. By 1946, most of the surviving Bettys in Allied hands were dismantled. A few sections were kept for research, a wing spar here, a nacelle there, samples of the non-armored aluminum for metallurgical testing. The reports were filed away, the hangars emptied, the war receded into memory, but the lesson endured. Every generation of engineers, confronted with new trade-offs between performance and safety, has encountered the same ghost. Whether in aircraft design, space exploration, or even automotive engineering, the Betty's shadow lingers as a quiet warning. The pursuit of range, speed, or efficiency cannot outfly the reality of human fragility. On a humid morning decades later, a Japanese historian stood before the corroded remains of a Betty wing half buried on Yap Island. The jungle had swallowed it whole, vines crawling through the torn metal, sunlight filtering through leaves. He brushed away the dirt and touched the fuel line still visible, still unprotected after all these years. He said softly, "This was our dream, and our failure." Then he closed his notebook and listened to the forest. The cicadas buzzed, indifferent, just as they had when those bombers once roared overhead. For the Americans who had examined the captured Betty in 1945, that scene would have been easy to imagine. They, too, had known dreams and failures. They had seen the best intentions consumed by the fire of combat. And so, in the twilight of the hangar, when they sealed their final report, perhaps they understood something deeper than technical data. The Betty was not simply an enemy aircraft, it was a mirror showing what happens when innovation races ahead of humility. Today, more than 80 years after its first flight, the Mitsubishi G4M remains one of the most paradoxical aircraft of World War II. It was both a symbol of Japan's ingenuity and its undoing. Its sleek lines carried both pride and peril. Its range changed naval warfare, but its vulnerability revealed the limits of faith over physics. And in the end, when American pilots stood before that captured bomber, staring at its unprotected fuel tanks, they were not just examining metal, they were witnessing the cost of belief in its purest, most dangerous form. Because behind every decision of war lies a human heartbeat, and the Betty, fragile and beautiful, carried thousands of them into the fire. When dawn rose over Yokohama Bay in late 1945, the sky hung gray and swollen, like a wound that hadn't yet learned how to heal. Beneath that sky, a captured Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber sat quietly on the tarmac, its olive-green skin dulled by the salt air. American engineers and test pilots circled it in silence, their boots crunching over gravel and glass. The war was over, Japan had surrendered, and yet for these men one final question remained unanswered. Why had a nation of such engineering precision sent pilots to war in aircraft that could erupt into fire from a single trace around? Why had the Japanese left their bombers so utterly defenseless? For weeks they had taken apart the G4M piece by piece, cataloging every rivet, every gauge, every seam of the fuselage. The answers came slowly through burned wiring, twisted aluminum, and blackened control panels. The Betty's design philosophy was not a mystery of incompetence, but of desperation, of a nation fighting a war it could not afford to lose, and could not possibly win. Japanese engineers had sacrificed armor and self-sealing fuel tanks to gain what their dwindling industry could still deliver, speed and range. The G4M was never meant to survive. It was meant to strike deep and return by grace alone. The Americans, who built planes to protect the men inside, could hardly fathom that kind of logic. The test reports from the TAIU, the Technical Air Intelligence Unit, were clinical in tone but heavy with disbelief. When the American technicians drained the Betty's fuel tanks, they found no rubber lining, no protective coating, nothing but bare aluminum. When pierced, the tanks would bleed raw aviation fuel into the fuselage, turning the entire aircraft into a torch. On test stands, even small caliber hits ignited catastrophic fires in seconds. One engineer noted flatly, "The Japanese prioritized range above survivability, a fatal flaw disguised as tactical necessity." It wasn't arrogance, it was austerity, driven by the island nation's shortage of strategic materials and the crushing weight of Allied blockade. To understand the Betty, one had to understand the war Japan wanted to fight. The G4M was conceived in the late 1930s when Japanese doctrine envisioned lightning strikes across the Pacific long-range bombers, supporting fast-moving naval operations from island bases. Every kilometer of range mattered more than armor. The G4M could fly nearly 3,000 miles, twice that of many. American bombers of its class, because it carried vast quantities of fuel in its unprotected wings. In theory, it could reach targets no one else could. In practice, it meant that any bullet could set it ablaze. Its crews knew this well. They called their own aircraft Hamaki the Cigar because once hit, it burned with the same slow, consuming glow. The American pilots who first encountered the Bettys in the skies over the Philippines and Guadalcanal learned quickly to fear their torpedoes, but pitied their fragility. Gun camera footage often showed them erupting into brilliant orange fireballs after a single burst. In those days, before radar and long-range escorts, the Japanese advantage was still their reach. Betty bombers could strike Allied ships hundreds of miles from land, but as the war turned, as Hellcats and Lightnings filled the skies, that advantage became a curse. Outrun and outgunned, the Bettys became flying coffins. At Clarkfield, after the war, American flight crews prepared the captured bomber for a test flight. The engines, Nakajima Sake 11s, coughed and shuddered before roaring to life. Their sound sharp and uneven compared to the throaty hum of American radios inside. The cockpit smelled of old fuel and sea salt. The instruments were simple, almost crude, with labels and fading kanji. The control yokes were light, the frame thin. Every pilot who took the seat noted the same thing. The Betty felt fragile. It was quick, responsive but fragile. When they pushed it into a shallow dive, the airframe trembled like a living thing. When they banked, the wings flexed unnervingly, the creaks echoing through the fuselage. The report concluded that the G4M's strength was not in design sophistication but in the ruthless pursuit of a single purpose. Every gram was saved to extend range. Armor, radios, even crew comfort were afterthoughts. The crew had no protection against gunfire or fire. The navigator's seat was nothing more than a metal stool bolted to the floor. The fuel tanks, spread like veins through the wings and fuselage, connected directly without self-sealing membranes. In a war of attrition, this was suicide. But in Japan's view, a war fought across oceanic distances with limited steel, rubber, and fuel. It was a necessary risk. And yet, the Betty was not without triumphs. In 1942, its long-range capabilities allowed it to deliver devastating torpedo strikes at the Battle of the Java Sea and to sink the British battleships, Prince of Wales and Repulse. The first capital ship sunk solely by air power while underway. It was aboard a Betty that Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, took his final flight in 1943, shot down over Bougainville after American codebreakers intercepted his itinerary. The wreckage, still smoldering when found by Japanese search parties, told a grim truth. Even the Empire's most revered commander had fallen victim to the same flaw that haunted his creation: unprotected fuel and no chance of survival. When American engineers studied Yamamoto's downed aircraft, they noted how the fuselage had been torn apart not by impact, but by fire. The Betty's light structure, built from thin duralumin to save weight, disintegrated under heat. It was an aircraft built to be expendable in a war that demanded human endurance. By 1944, as Japan's resources dwindled, the Bettys were stripped further, converted into kamikaze platforms and special attack variants, carrying Oka rocket gliders beneath their bellies. What began as a tool of reach and precision ended as a symbol of desperation. At Otsugi in Yokosuka, where American teams catalogued captured planes, a quiet awe filled the hangars. The Betty, in all its frailty, embodied a paradox: technological brilliance constrained by scarcity. It could cruise farther than the B-25 and faster than early Hudsons, yet its crews had almost no margin for error. A single burst from an F-6F's 50 cals could turn a Betty into a funeral pyre. Yet they flew hundreds of them again and again, because to their commanders, range mattered more than men. It was a philosophy alien to Western air doctrine, but tragically consistent with Japan's wartime mindset. One test pilot later wrote that flying the captured Betty felt like holding your breath for 2 hours. The fuel gauges danced erratically, the engines surged and sputtered with temperature changes, and every vibration carried the reminder of how thin the skin was. He could feel the hum of the fuel sloshing in the wings. When they landed, the ground crew checked for leaks and found several. A stray spark could have ended the test then and there. For the Americans, these tests were more than technical evaluations. They were windows into a mindset, one shaped by geography and survival. Japan's air war had been built around reach and offense, not protection. Their fighters from the Zero to the Hayabusa shared the same creed: lightness above all. The Zero-2 had no self-sealing tanks in its early models. Its pilots survived by never being hit at all. When the tide of war shifted, that creed became unsustainable. By 1944, Japanese engineers knew it, but by then, the factories could no longer build anything else. The Betty bomber's final act came not in combat but in capitulation. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, a white-painted G4M, its tail stripped of markings, a green cross replacing the red sun, carried envoys from Tokyo to Aishima to negotiate the ceasefire with American forces. It was escorted by US P-38s, the same fighters that had once brought Yamamoto's Betty down. That image, the fragile bomber of a defeated empire, guarded by the aircraft that had hunted it, was the perfect epilogue to a story of ambition consumed by fire. After months of analysis, the Americans packed away the Betty's remains. Some parts went to museums, others to scrap. The engineer's notes concluded that Japan's aviation design had been innovative but strategically misguided. But for those who had seen it burn in the skies over the Pacific, the Betty was more than a lesson in engineering. It was a symbol of courage amid futility of men who climbed into thin aluminum shells, knowing they might never return. They fought not with armor, but with conviction. The airfields where those wrecks once smoldered are quiet now. Only the wind moves across them, carrying echoes of engines long silenced. The Betty's unprotected fuel tanks were not merely a flaw. They were a reflection of a nation stretched beyond its limits, where every drop of fuel, every inch of metal, and every life was weighed against the impossible geometry of a global war. And in that, perhaps, lies the deeper truth. The Americans who examined that captured bomber did not just uncover design secrets, they glimpsed the psychology of a fading empire. An empire that had gambled everything on reach, on speed, on striking first, and lost it all to the physics of fire. Because sometimes, history doesn't burn brightest where machines fail, but where men refuse to stop flying them.
If you've stayed to the end, you're one of the few who still wants the truth. Subscribe, and together, we'll uncover every secret the Second World War tried to keep buried.